Bhavani, it is so good to be here with you today. I'm just overjoyed that we get to be in conversation again and again. So I'm going to jump right in. I want to ask you about how you came to yoga and how yoga found you. So you've talked many times about how you took your first yoga class at 9 years old, and I want to ask you about that experience.
I wonder how yoga found me also. I have to say, and I would say it was really grace. It was such I'm so curious about that. And these are parts of those the mystery that we don't know, but that is just clear that there's a thread that's pulling us along. And yeah. So, I was born in 1968. So in the ethos of that time, it was such a groundbreaking time of consciousness raising and of exploration of the possibility of consciousness. And in that great diaspora, yoga was really starting to gain a little bit of a foothold. And it was still kind of a fringe thing, but it was around. So I remember being really little, like before first grade, and pretending to be a yogi. And I would take Padmasana, and I would do this with my sister, and I would pretend to lay on a bed of nails. So I have no idea where that came from, but it was just kind of a form of play. And but somehow it interested me, it compelled me. And then, there wasn't any instruction or anything like that. But one day I think I was in third grade, and my girlfriend Mala, and it was only like 10 years ago where I went, oh, Mala, right? Her mother was probably a yogini. And I was going to have an after school play date with her. And her mom said, hey, do you girls want to go to a yoga class with me? We were like, sure, let's go. And we went, and it was one of those light bulb moments. Like, I can even remember, it wasn't even just in my body, but it was like when your eyes open and you can see how the world is alive, and there's this sense of like sparkling, scintillating energy. And it was very, very classical kind of yoga. It wasn't goat yoga or chocolate yoga or any of those things. It was just really old school yoga. I don't even know what lineage it was because no one talked about that back then. Yoga was just yoga, but I imagine it may have been Satchitananda. That's just my inkling. And we did really classical poses like Surya Namaskara, the old school style, Uttanasana. We did Paschimottanasana, Baddha Konasana, Sarvangasana, shoulder stand. And I just remember this feeling of having arrived, that Hatha yoga moment, and that it was like this memory of something that I had always known and that I had lost, and that I was going to do this for the rest of my life. And I maybe went to one or two classes more after that, but I just kept playing with it on my own. And I didn't even think of it. It wasn't like doing yoga. It was just right. It just felt so right. And I grew up on the south side of Chicago. So my father was a professor at University of Chicago, which was really interesting. And they've written books on this community because it's like this hotbed of intellectuals. At the time, there were the most Nobel Prize winners in the world. And being in the city, it was surrounded by the ghetto and then the lake on one side. And our alley behind our house is where the ghetto began. Like, literally, there was like it was almost like a line in the sidewalk, but it was like there was the right side and the wrong side of the street, etc. So that situation, and my parents are both European. They both grew up starving during the war, World War II. they had so much trauma and fear. And then there was also a history of incest and abuse and all of this. So I was dealing with that in my home. It wasn't safe. And I just remember in that first yoga class feeling totally safe. And it wasn't a familiar feeling. And, it's like as a little child, to have that kind of an ache, to have that kind of a longing, to be touched in that way. And it was something that I could access for myself was, it was beyond words. It's too sweet for words. And it's really interesting because, who would I be without that? And I can say with conviction that yoga has saved my life. Yeah. So it's interesting, as I'm, now I'm 54 and a half. So do the math, I mean, I didn't have like an official yoga practice, but I was dipped in yoga and exploring it, and now that I think about it, I'm not saying I'm a rishi at all, but when we look at the tradition of how yoga evolved, it was like something that you explored on your own through your own curiosity. So I didn't really have much formal training until much later, but I was just curious. And that nature of curiosity and creativity is what really carried me forward. So yoga has just like led me on all these wonderful, kind of like paths that are ultimately coming home to myself. And it was much later, when I was introduced to the Yoga Sutras, and one of the professors at University of Chicago, Mircea Eliade, he wrote at length on shamanistic paths and yoga as shamanism, particularly the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And so the path of the shaman is when you wake up and you realize that something is missing in your ordinary experience of the world. And that something has been, you have this longing and you're in touch with this longing, you're in touch with this wound. And as much as you're searching for the healing and you're looking through all of these different mediums, you realize that you can only heal yourself. So it said that the path begins when you recognize that something's lost or something's been taken away from you. And then it's this long journey where you go to some height, you go to some distance, you go to some depth, you go into the dark woods, you start unearthing in yourself, and you rediscover this essence or this light that has been missing in you. And then you come back home and you actually have a choice. You may not go back home because that's a whole other yoga practice. We've all heard Ram Dass's sage teaching, if you think you're enlightened, go home for Thanksgiving, right? So some never go home because it's just too difficult to maintain that light. But then some, like Prometheus, they who stole fire from the gods, brought it back to humanity to evolve the culture. So it's been this long journey of just coming back to myself and kind of reclaiming my own joy, my own creativity. And ultimately, yoga is about reclaiming our wholeness. Yeah. And it's a long journey, it's like we were talking about this yesterday in the Yoga Sutra mentorship, about crystal clarity in Sutra 141. And that, we can't really have crystal clarity until we develop self-esteem. And so it's like going out into the world and, when you're really like chasing your own wholeness and we do that through the medium of the world, then we develop a sense of self-esteem and capacity. And of course, our dharma, what is our work and our own healing, then becomes our gift to the world. So then the world reflects back to you your worth. Someone says, oh my God, you said something to me that changed my life. And you think, I did? Really? That's incredible. I was just sharing my own process. And then we develop enough self-esteem and our ego gets healthy enough where we can let it go. Then we're clear, right? So yeah, it took a lot to develop that self-esteem, get the ego big enough and healthy enough. And of course it's still kicking around and knocking around, but just feeling the ease that grace is leading me by the heart.
Wow, thank you. It's really, really important to hear you articulate that journey, because often I find a similar path is like I was steeped in this tradition, as you call this, an indigenous yoga tradition since I was born. But to be able to put words to that and be able to say, yeah, at a very young age, it was in the culture, and you got this from somewhere and you just started playing with it, and how empowering that must have been as a young person who, you grew up in Hyde Park, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And what a culture that was at that time. And then being able to be infused by that as well and come to this yogic tradition. That's wow.
It's amazing. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, please continue.
Well, I was just, kind of reflecting on your journey and what it would be like to be raised in a yogic tradition, and seeing how you in your own way, it's like, as much as even when we're born into something, and Patanjali says we're already born in our wholeness, but we have to discover that on our own. So it's like seeing your own unfolding, and I think that's the beauty of yoga. And when we're stuck in these, the branding or the, the hijack where this is a tradition and this is the only way, etc., we kind of lose the beauty of the eclecticism. And that doesn't mean, because I very much value, and it's been an integral part of my experience, is having a close relationship with my teacher. And I'm not talking about a weekend. I'm not talking about a year. I'm talking about decades. And as I look at you, who I have so much respect and admiration for, like, you're the future of yoga right here. That, we find our tribe in that way. And being born into a tribe, or being born into a tradition, and getting inculcated with that awareness, because like it says in the Gita, we inherit the nervous system of our parents. So that's why being born to yogis is such an auspicious birth. Like, you already came in with a nautic system that was so, ripe and diverse and expanded. And yet, like, you still got to leave to come and find yourself. And that is the tradition, that every generation, there's an evolution to it. And that's what's so exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, when I first met you, when Jesse and I were on honeymoon in Kauai, that was 7 years ago. And it was from Mariana Kaplan. She said, go seek out Bhavani. And I was like, okay, because Mariana's suggestions can either be totally wild or totally on point. And it was like, and my spiritual teacher, Lee Lozowick, in his community I grew up in, he had died 5 years before I met you. And I was only 23 when he left his body. But I found that the way you articulated the teachings of Patanjali was the same way that he articulated his path of the Western Bauls. And so the Bauls are from India, and they're traveling minstrels, basically. They're artists and they're dancers, and they go in between castes. So they wear these patchwork jackets of the Hindus and the Muslims, but also just lay people, and they get married, and they also practice, in a way that's very householder yoga. I mean, there's ascetic bowels, but basically what they do is they're the predecessors to the gypsies. So the gypsies came out of India, and that's where flamenco dancing came from, and all of those, and that tradition as well. And so when I heard you articulate the Yoga Sutra that very first day, like I walked into your classroom, and it was, for me, it was a coming home, because I heard my guru's voice coming through, and it was a way to embody his teachings once again. So it had been 5 years. He'd been gone, left dead. And it was such an amazing experience to have those teachings. And so then I went on to study, Sri, his name just left my mind, Sri Anirvan. And to his book, To Live Within, was actually written by Lizelle Raymond. And so she talks about this Samkhya yoga tradition. And it was like, for me, it just like put all the pieces together with Patanjali Yoga Sutra and the bowels. And I was just like, oh, like such a revelation for me as still a young person. It was like late 20s, but it was like the next level and the next deeper layer of working with my teachers. And so maybe you want to say something about that, but I also want to ask you about your teachers.
Yeah. So, there isn't a visual, perhaps, during this podcast, but I love the way that you were weaving and lacing your fingers together. And for me, it's interesting, like we talk about Samkhya philosophy, and Patanjali, he comes from the Samkhya tradition, but he was a rogue. He was a renegade. And so, the tradition has always, in any like cultural advancement, somebody had to break the rules. The leaders always broke the mold at some point. And the way, so he was really a tantric. And Tantra is about weaving the random threads, the streams and strands that have come into our life. And it's really about taking kind of like these loose ends and odd bits and colors and weaving your life into a beautiful tapestry. So that's what I love so much about, when I was introduced to the sutras, well, there was the first introduction, which I did dutifully. And I was just like, these are pithy. I'm not really getting it because it didn't have prana. Oh my God, I just got it. My teacher, Baba Haridas, he was a Mauna Baba. He didn't speak. So anyway, like, I mean, there was prana behind it, but he was also a monk. So it wasn't until I had a householder and a woman, my teacher, Rama Jyoti Burnan, who, like, when she spoke, not only from her heart, but from her pelvic floor, like it literally, I started weeping, right? But it was always about stepping out of the tribe. And Patanjali, came from this Shramana tradition, which were really free thinkers. They advocated free thinking. So the way that we have to, the journey begins when you realize that the life you're living is no longer nourishing you. And you have to step into the unknown. And that is so scary. I mean, that's the leap of faith. That's the leap of courage, where you don't know, you're just jumping off and you're trusting that you're going to land somewhere. it reminds me of in the tarot deck, the Fool card, which is the 0.
That's my card this year.
Oh, really? That's quite perfect. And so the 0 is actually, this is where Western mathematics kind of fails, because they don't teach that as an integer, but it's the most powerful integer because it holds all relationships within it. And it's that sense of the sacred enclave, the sacred circle, and what is known, and the infinite unknown outside of it. And so in the Fool card, there he is. He's got a rose. I believe it's a white rose, I believe. And it symbolizes the purity, the innocence, and he's just stepping off of a cliff into the unknown. So that's really the courage, and that's when grace happens. Sometimes it isn't even a conscious choice. I had this, full body like revelation this summer in Greece when I was meditating. We did a ceremony one night and stayed up all night, which I highly recommend. Stay up all night and, be trashed the next day, because it's good to step out of your day-to-day nitty-gritty. And I, was so tired and so trying to hold it together and sit and meditate. And I realized that, like, I kind of reached the end of my rope, or the end of my cliff. Let's see if I can articulate this well. And the sutras speak about this, that surrender is not an effort, but it's a moment of grace. And it's trusting that, like, okay, I've done what I can do, and there's something bigger. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to lean into that something bigger and let go, because it's always been there for me. It's always been there. And it's often in hindsight. I mean, when we're like under a rock, or, pinned against a wall, or we're at our rope's end, we often don't see it. But in hindsight, it said we have 20/20 vision, and we go, okay, now I can really see how this was integral in the arc of my unfolding and my experience. So what have I got to lose? I'm going to lean into it. And it was just a really beautiful, beautiful moment.
Oh, yeah. That's exactly what's happening in my life. It's the end, it's it's that cliff, it's the cliff edge. And it's like, okay, I have done all that I can do, and now I surrender. So take me back to would you consider Baba Haridas your first teacher, or did it start before that? And how did that happen?
How did that happen? I made my circuitous route to the left coast or the west coast. I'd lived in Canada, I lived on the East Coast, and finally moved to California, Northern California.
How old were you?
I was 19.
Okay.
Let me think about that. Yeah, I was 19. I graduated early from high school. And then I was in Santa Cruz Mountains, and there was a free yoga class at the Pacific Cultural Center. It was this cool Adobe style church in the heart of Santa Cruz. And I went to this free class, and I think that was like, I hadn't done a yoga class since I was 9 years old. But I have to backtrack, because I did actually get turned on to yoga philosophy earlier, and that was a huge pivotal moment. But so I went to this class, and that's when I was really introduced to some kriyas, the 4 purifications. And so I just took them on. And I continued with my Surya Namaskaras and my few postures. I mean, honestly, less is so much more. You really don't have to. We like to complicate things, but just doing a little bit. And then I had this background in yoga philosophy, because when I was in high school, I was a musician. So I played a lot of music. I was a trained classical musician and then dropped out of that and was, did self-taught guitar. I was a singer. And I was playing in the local watering hole at the University of Chicago, Jimmy's Pub. And they had like, encyclopedias on the wall and people were arguing quantum physics and things like that. And so I was playing there and I started dating the bartender who was a graduate student. No, actually, he was a PhD candidate. So he was a lot older than me. I think I must have been 16. I was little, but I was precocious. And my girlfriend, Wenda, we looked a lot alike. So I had her ID and I could walk into this bar. So between like shots of Jim Beam and drinking, like Leinenkugels, I hooked up with the bartender. And, we dated for a little while. And then finally he looked at me and he said, you're really sweet, but you're a little young for me. And I think you should find someone your own age. But here, I have a gift for you. And he gave me a copy of the Bhagavad-Gita, which he was writing his dissertation on. And I was so forlorn. I don't even know. I mean, I wasn't that forlorn, but it's like there was that part of me that was still trying to find myself through somebody else. And so I opened this book and it was not an easy read. I mean, there was this really exhaustive relayance of the lineage of all these people and whatnot, but I just stuck with it. I thought, I want to be as big and as smart as this guy. I'm going to prove myself. So I kept reading. And it was just, talking about the ideas of karma. And it was like, for me, like I knew it to be true. And that's how yoga has always been for me. It's like, it just landed and it was like, the articulation of what I knew to be true. So these ideas of karma. And then the other one that really stuck out for me was Maya, was the veils. And I knew, because I came in with a lot of joy. I came in like I was just a rascal. I was, always naked, jumping into people's laps, sneaking into the neighbor's home, eating their cookies, sitting on their bellies in bed while they were sleeping. Like I just had this tremendous amount of love. I don't know. God made me that way. It's not anything I did, but I had that kind of joy. And it was really compressed and shut down. And so I could just feel like I had all these heavy layers on me. And so this idea, this concept of Maya and all of these veils and all of the projections of how we should be and shouldn't be, I just knew it to be true. So my whole lens had shifted. So even though I was doing like a little bit of asana, I really feel like it was the Gita that just pulled the veils off and I started to see more clearly. And then it was on. I mean, honestly, I like made this vow. I took this vrata and I had no idea what I was doing. And I said to myself internally, I want to complete all my karmas in this lifetime. Now, I probably won't, but making that kind of a commitment, it was just instant karma. So many things happened. And it was a rough ride, for a really, really long time. But I always knew that there was a purpose behind it. And I think that's the difference. It's like so many people are in pain. Pain's not something you can get away from, even though in the dictionary, pain is defined as what we try to get away from. It's always, yeah, I looked it up. I mean, I'm a linguist daughter, so I'm like, well, what does this word mean? I know what it is, but like, how is it defined? So pain is defined as what humans strive to end. Isn't that interesting? And then I really became clear that pain could have a purpose. And that whatever pain, even though pain is endless, not every pain is endless. And we can move to deeper layers, and that the purpose behind it is that we gain wisdom so we don't have to create the same pain again, right? So yeah, my when I studied with Patabi Joyce, who I studied with for quite some time, he used to he had this phrase he would say, the sweet pain of being alive. Yeah, so Baba Haridas was really my first teacher, but I only, I would come out of the mountains because I didn't live in Santa Cruz proper. I lived up the coast from Davenport towards Half Moon Bay, and then 6 miles up a private dirt road in the middle of the redwoods without running water or electricity. So I would have to come all the way down, and that was like a good 30 minutes or 40 minutes. It seemed like a long ways back then. So again, I just would hit a few classes, but I took it on. And then the yoga worked on me. It worked on me from the inside out. I didn't really have, and I'm a learner, I come from a long line of learners and academics. So, this is like, I'm very attached to my library, and I would just read and learn and practice, and the ache was so deep. The hunger was so deep that I don't really know that I had a choice.
I'm curious about that because it seems to me that right now in our current culture of 2022, there's a lot of distractions to not feel that ache or that burning desire, or that, even the ability to take it on. Like you've talked about that a lot. And I really resonate with that mood of taking something on. And I'm curious what you think. Is it just your disposition that was ability to take it on, and how much of it is now just being filled with distraction? Or I don't know. I'm curious.
That's such a good question. But I can say statistically, I should have overdosed in an alley with a needle in my arm. Coming from a history, like a deep, deep history of trauma and abuse, and having been raped and molested and just beaten down on every level. I was trying to get away from pain. And there was a period too where, somebody turned me on to, I don't know, it was some kind of like I think barbiturates. So you take a
Don't
pill,
know what.
I don't know, it was something like that, but you take a pill and you go to sleep and you feel nothing. And I remember, and I was like, oh my God, this is great. Like, I really just wanted, in some ways, I just wanted to, I would have chosen being dead over being alive because it was so painful. So then to find something that could take me out of this feeling of like there was no coherency in my family. There was no place to hide. And then, I learned much later, and it was my sister who actually pontificated it for me. I was the dog that everybody kicked at the home. So it was just so painful. And then this grace of yoga came into my life, and it felt safe. It felt wonderful to be alive. Like I could see the beauty. I could see the joy that I had come in with. And joy, again, is a word that is, that has become watered down, and it has a saccharine sweet quality, like, oh, enjoy. But I'm talking about the joie de vivre, what we see in the plants as they're bursting forth, what we've all been seeded with in our blood. And I could feel that again. It was just like, it was like I was Remember in that Sutra class where it was like, you're drowning in the sea of samsara, of conditioned existence. You're not thinking how you got there. All you're thinking is how you can get out. So it was like I was being thrown a life preserver. Let me just pause this for a second. Yeah, so somebody threw me a lifeline and I just grabbed on. I grabbed on because I didn't, here's the thing. I didn't know how to get out of this situation. I didn't know how to change. I didn't know how to do anything different, but something like inside of me had instant recognition. Like there was a crystal clarity in that, which was immediate. And I've been really fortunate that way. I mean, some things for sure I belabor, and I've learned in the sutras, it's like, what does our mind do? We hit upon a truth and then the mind argues itself out of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we do want to have logic and rational thinking. But when it comes to like spiritual growth, which isn't just some woo-woo word, I love what Mr. Iyengar said. It has to land in your cells. It has to land in your nervous system. It has to land in your emotional body. It has to land in your rational mind. Only when we've addressed all those aspects can we call something spiritual. It's not a bypass. It's like going through all of these avenues. So sometimes I will do that in other situations, but there was none of that with yoga. I just knew. I just knew.
So then Baba Haridas asked you to go study with Patabi Joyce, or he suggested it, or?
He did, so basically, I mean, I had moved to Kauai at that point, and backtrack, I think it was, the year I was 19, I was hit by a car walking across the street by a drunk driver. That's an amazing story in itself. And
You want to tell it?
I guess I could,
Yeah.
Sure. So I was in this, dysfunctional relationship, surprise, surprise, because that's all that I knew. And this boyfriend was really, really controlling. And so we were deadheads. And so he was off on tour, and I said, well, I'll meet up with you later. And I went to Boulder, Colorado, and I was checking out Naropa. I was interested in their sound healing program. So I was staying at a little like hostel, and I went and did a day of classes, and I was just so turned on. So I was going to cross the street to the payphone. This is pre-mobile phones, to call him and break up with him. And as I was stepping into the street, which, oh my God, is the picture of the Fool card, I looked left, I looked right, I looked left. The coast was clear. And as I was stepping into the street, I had to sneeze. So I would, and you know how you close your eyes? And so there was this moment, it said that like the soul leaves the body in that moment. That's why they say, bless you. And then the next thing I knew, I was completely like floating. And I know it sounds trite, but it's the real deal. And there was just infinite light. And I felt myself expanding into the infinite expanse of, what was it? Just of lightness of being. And I thought, this is wonderful. And then I had a moment and I thought, well, should I go back? And I thought, nothing's holding me back. I don't have kids. I have nothing holding. I'm going. And then I heard this woman screaming, oh my. And I thought, oh shit, I got to go help this woman. So I came back and I opened my eyes, and she was standing above me and screaming. And I thought, wow, she's really distressed. And I tried to get up to help her. and my body wouldn't move. So I went out again, and I was just like evaporating, literally evaporating into the light. And then the next thing I heard was the voice of the paramedic saying, breathe, breathe. And so I came back in, and fortunately, I mean, the grace behind it was because I was sneezing. You know, if I had seen this car coming, I probably would have gone rigid and broken a lot of bones. I didn't break a single bone. I mean, I tore my rotator cuff. I had a 2nd-degree tear in my knee. I had glass coming out of my body a year later. And then I had I had such severe whiplash and all of these tears along my spine that my body would go into spasms and I would be dry heaving, but they couldn't treat it in any other. I mean, I would see the chiropractor, my body would seize up and I'd have to go 2 days later. And that's, it wasn't working for me. I knew I couldn't do that. So that's when I really took on asana practice. So I, got deeper into my asana practice. I moved to Kauai, and Kauai, the climate was perfect, where in the cold, like the cold chill of the mountains, it would put me into hypertension. So my body felt better. And I got introduced to Ashtanga Vinyasa system from a teacher, Chandra, who nobody knows, and nobody knows her last name because none of that mattered back then. And she did her own eclectic version of it. And she'd also studied under Baba Haridas. So there were the 4 purifications, the Kriyas. And then when she was moving to Maui, where she still is today, I believe. And at the last class, she said, don't worry, I'm not leaving you without a teacher. Bhavani, well, I was Sylvia at the time. Sylvia's going to take over my classes. And of course, I freaked out, and I'm laying there in Shavasana, and I went and I said to her, I'm not ready. And she said, no, you're not, but you're the one. So you have to promise me that you're going to step into this role and you're going to do 20 minutes of study every night. So I thought after that, oh my God, I got to get some training. So I went back to Mount Madonna Center, did training, and he had told us younger ones that it would do us well because we had so much energy to study Pattabhi Joyce's system. So then I was like, okay, I got to go to Mysore. I got to go to India. And I started, and that's when I kind of, that's when I met Pattabhi Joyce. And I made 7 trips to visit him there. I also visited him in France and England, all over the US, and, hosted him a couple of times on Kauai. And that was a really amazing journey. It wasn't so clean as people know, but he had something for me. He taught me tapas. He taught me real discipline. Yeah. So that was how Baba Haridas, he said, go do that. And then it was interesting because it was still really kind of, I got in there before it got really big and really sexy. I think Madonna was the one who really blew it up. So then as the Ashtanga Vinyasa system became really glitterati and sparkly and kind of like this elite group of athletic super yogis, the students would go to Baba Haridas, and because people were equating Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga with the Ashtanga Vinyasa system. And they said, well, what do we do? Because people have this expectation. Should we change the name? And he wrote on his chalkboard because he was silent. He said, no, this is Ashtanga. This is Patanjali's full Ashtanga system. You don't change the name. And I think, Pattabhi Joyce gave that name to it to inspire people to go a little bit deeper. Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that's really helpful for about the Ashtanga. So I want to talk about Rama Jyoti Vernon also. We only have a few minutes left, but I want to include her because there was a pivotal moment for you when you hosted her on Kauai, and I want you to talk about that also.
Yeah. So, I was just doing my thing, teaching yoga, and basically I had like 3 or 4 jobs. I was teaching piano, I was teaching flute, I was teaching voice, I was teaching at the Waldorf school, French, believe it or not, and making smoothies and cleaning houses. Like I did anything. I lived in a shack and felt like a queen because I was living on Kauai. And I did all of this so I could just do yoga. And then teaching was such a joy because I was learning so much and realized that my students, I was a student with them under my teacher. So they were raising me. Like those first classes, I had a piece of paper and I was like, Hari Vrita, I mean, they knew that I had been elected into this position and and we just loved the practice. So it wasn't ever about the teacher. So, teaching was such a joy for me and such a privilege. It was never about making money. It was never meant to be a career. And I would do anything just so I could keep doing yoga and teaching yoga. Um, So anyway, I would teach literally, I cannot even remember all the places that I've taught. I would teach on this person's lanai, in this person's backyard, like anywhere. So at one point, this woman, Lynn Moffatt, who was kind of like she was one of Bikram's original students. He taught her one-on-one and he was a shyster, as we all know, but like as was Pattabhi Jois, but they had something. That doesn't mean that you don't have to throw away the teachings just because someone's flawed. So, and then she came from a Baramji tradition. She like had a true yogic tradition. And I had done the training with her daughter at Mount Madonna. So she moved to Kauai and she was looking for somebody to open a yoga studio with. There were no yoga studios on Kauai, except for Enshara Mahal, Taj Mahal's wife. She had a bookstore on the south side of the island where they would do yoga classes sometimes. So Lynn wanted to open a really like a space dedicated to yoga. And so she was looking around like who she was going to do this with. And there were teachers here and there. Everybody kind of had, it was still really niche and kind of fringe. And so anyway, her daughter told her about me. And I guess she came to my class and vibed me out. And she invited me to open a studio with her. So we opened the studio, I've been a student of astrology since I was 17. My husband is a really a very good astrologer. I was in a community of astrologers, and I'm talking about people who they weren't dilettantes, like everybody's an astrologer now, but like really steeped in the science. And at that point, like charts, you had to draw them up. It was a mathematical process. It was like, it was arduous. So I was in this community of astrologers and we sat down and we found the auspicious date, which was 9/9/1999. And then we actually got PO Box 990, like serendipitously. So we opened the studio and the monks from the Hindu temple, which we have a really nice relationship, came and they did a puja, like a real puja. And the head Swami said, may this be more than a yoga studio, but a place of great learning. May it become a university of yoga. And he really like set this imprint, but all we were really doing was asana in there. So I had my Ashtanga classes. Lynn had her Bikram classes, which I wasn't that psyched about Bikram practice, but I had so much respect for her. And that's where it really is about the teacher. It doesn't matter what you're doing so much. And this woman, Barbara Curl, came and she, hang on a second here. So Barbara Curl was really a luminary. She had, this visions of the advancement of the community and the possibilities of Kauai, and would work with with the local government and kind of the other visionaries and inspired people on the island. And she ended up hosting Rama Jyoti Vernon for this conference on Kauai called WOVA, Women of Vision and Action. And then they invited local people to, I was invited to teach yoga at this conference. And the theme of this conference was, how are we going to train the next generation of leaders? Like we need, and when you look at indigenous communities, it's like there's certain children that don't fit the mold. They're the ones that aren't there, they're not designed to matriculate or to like learn this kind of like do rote learning. They're more sensitives, they're more intuitives, they have divya drishti, they see things in a different way, their field is open in a different way, and they're kind of pulled aside from the tribe, and they're given a very special training as healers, right? So, we're kind of lacking that. We're lacking that in our culture. So how do we do this? How do we create a context where we can hold these young visionaries and support them instead of telling them how it should be? Because we need leaders who are going to be able to break the rules. That being said, you have to know the rules before you break them. So, it was just a really inspired conference. And then Barbara asked me to help counter the expenses of putting together this conference. Would I host Rama for a yoga workshop at my yoga shala? So I said, absolutely. At this point, now everybody's a yoga teacher, and I had to learn that I couldn't just have somebody come sight unseen, because whoa, you never know that person's agenda. But, so Rama came in and she taught the Yoga Sutras. And I had learned the Yoga Sutras. Well, I hadn't learned them, but when I was studying under Baba Haridas and my teacher Chandra had said, you should teach, I thought, okay, I need to really get a foundation of the basic text. So I opened the Shiva Samhita, the Garanta Samhita, the Pradipika. I was already deep into the Gita and the Yoga Sutras, 196 sutras. You can read them in 20 minutes. I had a little bit of unpacking through Baba Haridas's thing, but it was just very like, yoga is the stopping of the mind. And it felt really rigid. And Rama, it's hard to put into words, but the way that she spoke, and she spoke from her own experience, and she spoke from her heart, she authenticated the teachings, and she was a practitioner. So it wasn't theory. People call it like yoga philosophy. Yoga is not meant to be a philosophy. Yoga is a psychology, right? So she spoke, and at this point, I was really deep into Pattabhi Jois's system, and it was also very rigid in its own way. And it was highly competitive and hierarchical. So like when you achieve proficiency in this pose, you get the next pose. If he likes you, or if, you're showing up, and, there were all of these contingencies. So I had gotten really rigid in myself. And that longing that had been like slaked initially through my nascent contact with yoga, it had come back and it wasn't really being addressed. And so as she was speaking and as she was sharing these sutras, it was like, I just saw how yoga, the way that yoga had become so rigid. And honestly, these very patriarchal traditions had actually become another aspect, another veil or another box to break free from. And I literally, I mean, she just cracked me open. She cracked me open, and she touched my heart in such a deep way. And after that visit, I thought, I'm going to learn the Yoga Sutras. And I started like memorizing them. And I memorized the first chapter. There's 51. I memorized them in 51 days. And you've memorized the first pada. So you know what that's like. But that's how hungry I was. And, you know, there's a lot more to share about Rama. That is, you know, we can go on and on about that. I can't even put into words how wonderful it is to find someone who shares from their heart, who there's no hierarchy, who recognizes who you are and sees you as a companion, a colleague. And so as much as she was my teacher, we connected on such a deep level. She was my Didi. She was my big sister. And that really changed the way that I also relate with my students. I mean, certainly, you know, I'm maybe more seasoned and more steeped in things. And so I can hold, you know, I have something that I can share with them, and there is a gradient there. But as far as the level of mutual respect, if somebody has a hunger for what I was hungry for and what I've been eating and cooking and whatnot, there's a soul to soul communion and recognition where, you know, and it's wonderful how, you know, the path unfolds underneath us. And I think it was, you know, we've had so many wonderful conversations. Like it said, the student and the teacher pull the wisdom out of each other. I feel that so much with you. And you have this capacity to ask the right questions, you know, it's like all about the right question. And one day we were talking about that, and it was like, this is a heart lineage. This is a love lineage. This is a heart to heart connection. And so that's where I really felt that again. The sense of this teacher sitting on a dais, it wasn't that way. She lifted me up to her level. And although she's left her body, like she is enshrined in my heart.
Thank you. That's a great place to end for today. Perfect.
Let it be. Let it be.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure always to sit with you, Shanae.
Same. Same.
All right. Well, maybe before we close, I'll just say that, you know, my doors are always open. My heart is open, and, you know, I welcome you, and I welcome anyone who is longing for something beyond the diluted stream, but something that's really raw. You know, it's like a raw juice. I got raw juice for, you know, anybody who's thirsty in that way. And I, you know, I have my book and I have my online sutra stuff. I'm always sharing in different ways. So anybody who's hungry or wants that, you know, come find me, Yoga Kauai.
And we'll link all of that in the podcast notes.
Yeah, great.
Great.
Okay. Aloha.
Aloha.